As you may just be able to tell from my accent, I was born and bred in Hull. So I grew up in a rugby league family, as a lot of people do. I started looking at the relationship between rugby league and society, not because I was a fan, but because when I did a master's way back 30 years ago, I wanted to look at how the crucial period from about 1870 to 1914, how that impacted on the making of the modern working class. And there's a famous essay by Eric Hobsbawm called The Making of the Working Class, 1870 to 1914. So I wanted to look at that. And initially my idea was to look at the politics of the period. But I was advised, in hindsight, quite rightly, that the kind of political stuff was already, there'd been a lot of it done. And also this was just... this is like 2 or 3 years after Thatcher. And he said, well, Labour history is not very popular. Look at a different angle, which is, I thought, well, nobody's ever done anything on why there are two codes of rugby and how the split of 1895 happened. So I got into it that way. So it's kind of my passion and my profession kind of came together through Rugby League. And I've since actually done a book about the origins of the British Communist Party. But that's how it came about. It's sort of, don't write about Rugby League or sport, particularly because I'm a fan. I write about it because of the window that it offers to look at British society and the society around the world. It offers a window to look at that society with a very different perspective than what you'd get from a kind of straightforward political history or economic history.
That leads me on really to, I was reading your book, Rugby League in the 20th Century, and the thing that really struck me in the preface of the book is you contrast comments George Orwell made in 1936 about sort of the northern working class, and he's quite critical of their sort of socialist politics. But then you talk about the vibrancy of collectivity of Rugby League, which at the same time Orwell's there, Liverpool Stanley are playing Wigan in Wigan, and how that's played by working class people, and how Orwell sort of ignores that. Why do you think this sort of snobbery of the sport began? And do you think it said something or say something about working class life in Britain throughout the sort of long 20th century?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the roots of it go back to really the roots of rugby and to some extent football in the middle of the 19th century, because this football codes, football and rugby, were originally conceived in the public schools where the rules come from as something that would help the moral education and develop the leadership skills of Britain's elite. And when in the 1870s and 1880s, the rugby and football became mass spectator sports that ultimately by the 1880s became dominated by working class teams and working class spectators, it led to a desire on the part of those members, young members of the British ruling class, to argue that somehow the game that working class people played was different and less intelligent, less sophisticated, less uplifting in many ways from the game that they intended. So you get a similar thing, people looking down their noses at professional football, but because football doesn't split and there's a compromise reached to avoid it splitting in the 1880s, then kind of what happens in football is that the upper classes still play football and the working classes play football, but they don't really play together. It's kind of two separate worlds. In rugby, the Rugby Football Union in the 1880s realised that the introduction of professionalism into soccer had led to the eclipse of middle class, upper class teams like the Old Etonians, Old Carthusians, the Royal Engineers, that had dominated football. Their domination was ended by teams comprised of working class players in the north of England and in the Midlands. The Rugby Football Union leaders didn't want that to happen. They didn't want to lose their position at the top of the pecking order in rugby union, and so they introduced amateurism, and then that eventually led to a civil war in rugby, which led to the 1895 split. And you can tell as soon as that split, well, even before the split happened, and certainly after the split happened, it was justified in terms of, well, working class people don't really know what they're doing. They're not intelligent enough to play rugby in the way that we play it. And so it's not surprising that they have opted to become essentially mercenaries, entertainers. They've abandoned rugby. And this demonstrates that they don't have our sophisticated understanding of the morality of the game, and they don't have our understanding of the technicalities of the scientific nature of the game, which of course is all rubbish. Partly what was going on was that working class people in the north of England and in South Wales for that matter, wanted to see rugby played in a different way. Running, passing, handling, scoring tries rather than rucks, mauls, scrums, lineouts and goals, which is really the way that the southern upper classes wanted to play. And that's basically still the divide between the two sports today. So class was built into the two rugbies from that moment in 1895 that they split apart. And that's what makes looking at rugby, whether you're a fan of what actually goes on in the pitch or not, that's what makes rugby so interesting, because all the class tensions in Britain were played out on the sporting field, and it was kind of resolved by two sports that were, one was predominantly middle class and had its own kind of ideology and culture and values, and the other that was overwhelmingly working class, and that had a similarly opposed set of values and cultural identity. So, I mean, it's literally the old cliche that the only thing they have in common is the shape of the ball and the post. It's true, because there's, the gap socially and culturally between the two codes of rugby has never been wider.
And could you explain sort of briefly for people who maybe aren't familiar with rugby league what the sort of implications were of rugby union trying to remain as an amateur sport, basically why rugby league split away and how that sort of came to be?
Well, when rugby union introduced amateurism in 1886, the leaders of the northern clubs tried to compromise to say, okay, we don't necessarily want full professionalism because it's high risk economically and financially. But what we would want to do is to compensate our players for the time that they had to take off work to train or to play the game, because in those days there were no paid holidays. And if you took time off work to play rugby, then you did it unpaid. You had to support yourself. And so the northern club said, we think that players shouldn't be financially disadvantaged by having to play the game. So we'd like to pay them broken time, just cover the wages that they lose. And the RFU refused to compromise, started to suspend clubs, to suspend players they suspected of either receiving money or giving money. And it came to a head in 1895 after a series of suspensions of clubs like Huddersfield, Wigan, Salford, Leigh, in late 1894 and early 1895. So after a series of suspensions in 1894 and 1895, it culminated in the northern clubs resigning ahead of them being expelled or picked off one by one by the RFU. And so it was that deep divide was embedded in rugby from the word go, in both codes of rugby from the word go. The other thing to bear in mind from a broader angle is that this was a period of intense class struggle in Britain. From 1888, when you had the great dockers strike in London, you had the matchwomen's strike. There's a massive growth in trade unionism, in militancy of the working class. You've got the growth of new unionism, the rise of unions for unskilled workers. And especially in Yorkshire. In Yorkshire in 1893, at precisely the same time that the RFU had one of its decisive discussions about whether broken time payments should be allowed, Yorkshire was in the grip of the first national miners' strike since the 1840s, which involved many of the players and many more thousands of spectators. So the whole debate was framed by the rise of increasingly self-confident working class, who were prepared to take strike action and act in their own interest. So really what's going on is that it's that middle and upper class fear of a rising working class, as evidenced by the rise of new unionism, the formation of the Independent Labour Party in 1893 as well. That came into rugby as a fear of the working class taking over. So the two fears of what was going to happen, of the great mass of people surging up and taking control, was reflected in rugby, because that's what the leaders of the RFU feared, that working class players would take control of the game, which is why they were so steadfast in their refusal to compromise.
There's something that really doesn't change, isn't there, throughout rugby league? You've got to crunch the numbers in your book, and you found that rugby league actually grew more working class. And even in the 20th century, between the 1950s and the 1990s, the number of players who worked in sort of blue-collar professions actually increased. And do you think that sort of explains the sport's enduring appeal, especially in its heartlands in Northern England? Do you think people sort of see their own lives and opportunity reflected in the sport still as due to that relationship? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, obviously, the demographics of Britain have changed over the last 130-odd years, but nevertheless, I think that's remained the same. I mean, I think because one of the things is that, to some extent, you have to choose to be a rugby league supporter, even if you come from a rugby league family, like I did. There's still, because football in Britain is so ubiquitous, so powerful, so dominates the media, rugby league means taking a kind of step in a different direction. It's a minor rebellion against the status quo. And I think that most people who are involved in the game, either as a spectator or a player or whatever, understand that it sees itself and is predominantly in its makeup a working class sport. Even today, you know, you just have to go to look at the crowds on the terraces, or particularly go to an amateur rugby league match. One of the great ways of telling that is by also going to a rugby union match in the north of England. And it's a very, very different experience, a very different crowd. You know, the whole atmosphere is very different at rugby union. Even if, you know, you go to Headingley and watch Leeds Rhinos, probably the most well-heeled rugby league club in Britain, and then go and watch Leeds Carnegie, who play on the same ground and play rugby union. It's a different set of people. And that, I think, demonstrates the deep roots, the deep social roots that the two sports have across Britain, and still in the north of England. Because one of the things that sort of a misapprehension about what happened in 1895 with the rugby split was that it was a north-south divide. Well, that's true to some extent, but the reason for that is because the North was overwhelmingly dominated by working class players and spectators. And it was more about class than geography. And the evidence of that is that in Yorkshire and Lancashire, where obviously the rugby league teams came from in the majority, there was a direct split between the supporters of rugby union who came from local private schools, were university educated, or were based in sort of market towns like Ilkley or Vale of Loon in Lancashire. That class split was at its height, really, in the north of England, and that still survives today.
You know, you talk about Liverpool and Manchester were once quite prominent rugby league cities, and as I said at the beginning, in the introduction to your book, you talk about Liverpool's Stanley Rugby League team. Briefly, why have they sort of lost prominence in the rugby league world? I know you still have Salford and you still have sort of teams butting up against Liverpool, but both of them have sort of lost that a bit. Do you think it's just the rise of football?
Well, that's a good question, because it actually goes back to the 1880s, because originally Liverpool and Manchester and also in its own way, Newcastle, were originally rugby towns. Rugby was the dominant game. But what happened in Liverpool and Manchester was, because they were controlled by, you know, the sons of the local bourgeoisie. I mean, the Liverpool club was literally set up by the sons of ship owners, and the same in Manchester by and large as well. They did not want the game to spread down to the working classes or to become dominated by the working classes. And so they kind of learnt the lesson that the RFU had learnt from football. It differed from Yorkshire, because Yorkshire, very early on in rugby's history, in 1876, so this was essentially before there was mass working class involvement, started a county cup competition, the Yorkshire Cup, which was actually became a vehicle for local pride and raised the profile of rugby, and it led to the formation of teams, you know, right across Yorkshire, and so it became the national game of Yorkshire. And in a sense, the Yorkshire Rugby Union authorities realised in the early 1880s that it was now out of control and they could no longer dominate the game. Lancashire learnt from that and did not have a county cup competition. So they managed to keep control of the game and stop it getting out of hand, as they believed it had done in Yorkshire. The other thing that happened was that the Football Association, the Lancashire Football Association, was very aware of the power of cup competitions, because obviously football had the FA Cup competition, which is a big success. And so, whereas the Lancashire Rugby Union refused to have cup competitions and even less leagues, the Lancashire FA set up a cup competition in the late 1870s, had local leagues. And so that kind of civic rivalry, local interest that cup competitions and leagues generate, which are really the driving force of the expansion of football and rugby in the 1880s. Lancashire didn't have them. So if you're playing rugby in Manchester, you're playing friendly matches every week. But if you're playing football, you're in a local league competition, a knockout cup competition. There's all sorts of competitions. That's what brings life and adds spice to the competition. So a lot of the teams that were primarily working class based in Lancashire tried to campaign for cup competitions and leagues, but it's only just before the split that the Lancashire Rugby Union relented. But in that space, in that 10 years, you can see that rugby in Liverpool and Manchester was completely eclipsed and sort of became, in Liverpool, was confined in a strange way to those towns on the immediate border with Liverpool. Today you can get on the bus and go between Liverpool and St Helens or Warrington or Widnes, and you basically don't realise, it's all one continuous metropolis nowadays, but nevertheless, completely different sporting culture. So really, it's the refusal of the rugby union authorities to have engage with proper competitions that would bring in working class interest and sustain that working class interest that meant that rugby in Liverpool and Manchester withered.
You made the point that in working class communities, professionalism and the responsibilities it brought was seen as sort of a badge of honour. Rugby League sort of brought people. Do you think that sort of professionalism that signified by Rugby League played a sort of helped to maintain a sense of local pride as, a lot of these places have changed quite significantly since the 1980s economically, and they've moved from sort of industrial to post-industrial areas. So do you think Rugby League sort of helped maintain and generate a sort of sense of pride in these places?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a phrase that you don't hear nowadays, really. In Yorkshire and Lancashire, if you felt that something was the best it could be, or the best in its category, or the best beer there was, or the best bread there was, people would often say, it's the best in Northern Union. And by that, they meant it was the best of the best, because the Northern Union had the best rugby players. And it's that sense that, we're really good. We're really good. So we get paid because of that. We get recognised by our community because they pay our wages. It's the same as, in local cricket, when somebody takes a hat-trick or scores 50, the hat goes around. There's a collection for them. And so it's that sense that professionalism is due recognition of your talents, and also, in a sense, what you bring to the community, because you're giving them a winning team. So this phrase, that best in Northern Union, it kind of demonstrates how much that sense that Rugby League, or the Northern Union as it was until 1921, was the pinnacle of rugby. And it was used to demonstrate that the northern communities that played it were better than the people who thought that they were their betters. They were working class people could be the best rugby players there were. It's kind of like, in Australia, the phrase is, rugby league, the greatest game of all, which it's kind of bombastic, but I think it also reflects something of that. The other thing that it does, there's a great book by Eric Hobsbawm on jazz, and he makes the point that in Black American communities, the fact you are a professional jazz musician gives you enormous credibility, because it demonstrates to the community that they're as good as anybody else. And probably when it comes to music, they're better than anybody else. And so I think across all populations of people who feel that they're under the thumb or they're oppressed in some way, that professionalism and professional sport is a way of demonstrating that you're at least the equal to those people who see themselves as socially superior. In certain cases, you're obviously better than they are.
Do you think rugby league has been a more sort of racially equal and egalitarian sport? Obviously, there's still a big caveat with that. But one thing I sort of came across was that in 1968, when in the Mexico City Olympics, when John Carlos and Tommy Smith, the two Black American sprinters, were barred from competing in athletics in America for doing the Black Power salute on the podium, sort of iconic photograph. They actually ended up in Wakefield, trying to be signed by Wakefield Trinity and actually living in Wakefield for a bit, which is something that sort of blew my own mind. But do you think there's a sort of sense that the sport is a little bit more egalitarian and a bit more open towards people from sort of different backgrounds?
Yes, because, all proportions guarded on this. Because Rugby League was formed really on the basis of trying to maintain a principle that didn't matter how much money you had, didn't matter what your background was, what school you'd been to. If you were good enough to play at an elite level, then you should be allowed to do so, and that you shouldn't be penalised because you were working in a manual labouring job that wouldn't pay you for the time that you took off work. So there's a sense that, it's expressed like this at the time. And this is the other thing that's very interesting, that when I first went back to research this, I was amazed at just how much class was talked about, and that it was clearly seen by everybody involved that class was at the heart of the split. The middle classes not want to give up control of the game, and the working class is rising in the game. So that principle of equality was really at the heart of the game, and to some extent, you could say that rugby league is the only sport that was founded on a principle rather than a way to organise the playing of the game. And again, I think that also reflects the northern communities that the game was born in. That, obviously these were communities where trade unionism was strong, where people had felt the need to fight against the bosses or local bureaucrats or whatever. And so there was a strong sense of equality and the need for equality. There's a famous book about Featherstone miners produced in 1956 by Norman Dennis and Cliff Salter called Coal is Our Life. And they make the point that in those work in Featherstone, then there's actually quite a lot of interest in the civil rights struggle in America, because there's a kind of identity saying that people are, they have to fight for what they have, and they have to keep that fight up. I mean, there were a few black players playing rugby league before the First World War. Lucius Banks, who was a black American footballer, came over to play for Hunslet in 1912, which is just an amazing thing to consider. And even more amazingly, his grandson came over to Hunslet last year, having discovered the roots of his grandfather. That kind of belief that if you're good enough, then you should play goes all the way through rugby league. So in the 1930s, there were black players playing for England, playing for Wales at international level. I mean, this is like 50 years before black players were playing soccer for England or black players were playing rugby union for Wales. You got the first black coach in professional sport in Britain in Roy Francis in the 1950s, who was probably the only black person in the 1950s who was in a position of authority over white people. You've got the first black captain of a Great Britain side in Clive Sullivan in 1972, and so on and so forth. So it's a sport that has a very different historical profile to other sports in terms of racial integration. And that's also true in Australia and New Zealand. It's a great pub trivia question is, in which sport did New Zealand, Australia and Great Britain first have people of colour as their national captains? And obviously I wouldn't be telling you this if it wasn't. It's rugby league in 1937 in New Zealand, 1970, I think, in Australia. So, I mean, that's not to say it's a non-racist sport. There's plenty of problems that still have to be dealt with. And you talk to black players today, then it's still, there's still a lot of things that need to be dealt with. But I think what it does mean is that rugby league should hold itself to a higher standard, and that there should be absolutely zero toleration for any of this, because, our game's been built by black players as much as by white players.
The women's game is expanding and I think sort of growing in popularity. But what's the sort of place of women being in rugby league sort of historically? Well,
that's a very interesting question, because it's not, in one sense, it's not particularly good, because women playing the game has been historically discouraged. So, for example, in the immediate post-World War I period, where, I'm sure you're aware that lots of women's football teams sprang up during World War I and continued into the early 1920s, there's certainly evidence that women wanted to play rugby league as well, as they did in Sydney for a short time in 1921. So certainly women in rugby league areas wanted to play rugby league, but they were discouraged from doing so by rugby league clubs and encouraged to play football, because that in rugby league areas is often seen as a more feminine game, to put it very mildly. And so women didn't really play to any organised. I mean, there's one or two exceptions, like in the 1950s in Workington, but women didn't play in any really organised form until the 1980s, when it really began to take off. And it's got a real history from the 1980s, including, international matches against Australia, New Zealand and World Cups. So it's not got a very good record on the pitch. Off the pitch, women have been involved really since it started, before rugby league started, perhaps most famously that Broughton Rangers, the Manchester team, were the first team to do the rugby league double in the 1900s, originally were known as Mrs. Broughton's nicknamed Mrs. Broughton's Boys, because Mrs. Broughton ran the pub where they changed and was quite a significant figure in the running of the club as well. But there's been women involved as spectators in quite a big way from the late 1870s, certainly through the 1880s and 1890s. It's quite noticeable, I think, if you go to rugby league matches today and you compare the composition of the crowd with that of football, I think you'll find significantly more women. And women have had a significant impact off the pitch through things like supporters clubs, being on club committees, fundraising, providing all the ancillary facilities without which it would be very difficult to run a team. So there's a kind of unacknowledged labour being provided by the wives, mothers, girlfriends, daughters of players in order so they can play, just like washing the kit, for example, or tending to their injuries or the other small services that they perform unpaid. As well as the kind of volunteer stuff that goes on in that went on to the clubs from the very early days, especially from the 1920s when supporters clubs were formed. Women have always been involved in rugby league. It just hasn't treated them very well when it comes to playing.
That sort of leads me on to my final question to you, really. What do you see as the future of rugby league being within northern communities, or just the communities in general where it's played within Britain? What do you sort of see as the future of the sport? Because it was so tied to that sort of industrial past that's changed rapidly. So how do you sort of see it evolving or staying the same in some ways?
That's a good question, because obviously the world, and particularly the sporting world, is changing very rapidly. However, where the big sports in Britain were strong in 1914, just immediately before the First World War broke out, particularly football, rugby union, rugby league, they are still strong today. Football has grown to become something that's more than sport. It's part of the entertainment industry. So that has changed. But at a local level, then rugby league is still strong where it's been traditionally strong. I think the danger is that the impact of deindustrialisation and the emergence of the gig economy and the fact that the north of England hasn't recovered from the impact of deindustrialisation from the 1960s onwards, and the fact that the traditional industries upon which rugby league was built, the docks, the mines and the textile industries, don't exist anymore. That makes it harder for rugby league because it no longer has the kind of institutional resources to base itself on. So, for example, one of the things that was incredibly popular up until the 1970s were works rugby league teams. There were works leagues, across Yorkshire and Lancashire, based on teams composed of people who worked at the same factory or the same office or whatever. Those don't exist anymore. So a lot of this kind of props that held up rugby league have gone. Yet it's still, I think, because of its cultural importance and its cultural significance, it still survives. And I think that's really got to be, that's shoring up its traditional base has got to be the priority for the game in the future. I think it can still grow. I think there's a lot of untapped potential. And I think also the rugby union going professional has done two things, one good, one bad. The bad thing is that the flow of players, especially from Wales, of really high quality players like your Jonathan Davises and people like that, has dried up, which is unfortunate. And that's something the game has to think about because it's, player participation rates haven't really grown. But the good thing is that a lot of the old taboos that union had over rugby league, that union people in some cases were scared to go to a rugby league match in case they were spotted and then hauled up before the Rugby Football Union and potentially banned for life, as happened with lots of players. That no longer exists, and you find a lot of union players expressing their interest in rugby league. So there's a bit of an opportunity there. But I think fundamentally, rugby league will survive and will continue to be strong in its traditional communities. As we started, that's what it represents. That's what its ideology, its cultural significance is about working class communities, about the need for working class communities to express themselves on a sporting stage and also to express their excellence against those people who feel that they're their betters. And I think that's the case wherever you go in the rugby league world, in the north of England, in Australia, New Zealand, it's still the game of working people. And to be honest, its history in Australia and New Zealand is even more closely associated with the labour movement than it is here. And so that's an incredibly powerful element in the appeal of the game, let alone the fact that, it's a wonderfully and thrillingly exciting, spectacular athletic sport to watch. I don't think much will change providing the game understands how to maintain its roots in a healthy fashion.